First, I want to say, although these slides appear on an MHRA template, because I work at MHRA, that's not intentional. They just haven't been translated into the EMA template. I'm talking on behalf of the project group on implementation of the legislation on inspections and audit, who've been working very hard to provide input into the various pieces of text that we hope to be able to share in a final form in July. If I can have the first slide, please. Okay. Here I've provided the main part of the requirement around the Pharmacovigilance System Master File, and it is a detailed description of the pharmacovigilance system. That said, it is different to the existing DDPs for those of you that have been involved in producing and submitting the DDPs. Just to say, the regulation and the directive don't contain details, and the implementing measures have been drafted, which contain a lot more detail about the content and the management around the pharmacovigilance system master file. And in addition to that, we have the draft of the good vigilance practice that has now finished public consultation, and I hope everybody provided comments or even questions, because that helps us to refine the draft and make it really useful. The main difference from what will have been done in the past is that we will be describing and requesting information about the pharmacovigilance system, which could be one or more products. So we're moving away from a document that has to be produced and submitted per product, and in some ways can be quite repetitive. There's a lot of opportunity in this for reducing some of the repetitive activities that have occurred in the past surrounding this area. I'm not going to claim that I can provide all of the answers to all of the questions you may have, and I have seen the questions. The reason being that we still have to refine the guidance in line with questions that have been raised. Not everything has fallen to the ground yet. So we're in a period where we have some solid content, some solid things that we can produce, but there are also a lot of questions around the practicalities of what will actually happen in July. And that actually isn't covered in terms of transition in the implementing measures or the good vigilance practices. Those will come about through additional communications, questions and answers. Probably at an EMA level, the Commission have already produced some text on transition, and there'll be more text to come. So I'll try and take you through, but there are some very practical areas where at the moment we're still waiting for some decisions to be made or some final clarifications. Next slide, please. So, first of all, I just want to make the distinction between the Pharmacovigilance System Master File itself, which is a collection of descriptions, bits of data, lists of activities to describe the system, and the Pharmacovigilance System Summary, which is something different. The Pharmacovigilance System Summary is the part that talks to the marketing authorization. It's the part that links to the marketing authorization. It comes under Article 8 of the new directive, and it's the piece that describes the location of the master file and the contact details of the QPPV. There is no submission of the entire pharmacovigilance master file as part of an application or routinely. It is supplied to national competent authorities or the agency on request. It's only this part, the system summary, that is formally submitted. And there are some exceptions to that. We already know that the traditional herbal products, although they will have to have a pharmacovigilance system master file, there's no requirement for them to amend the marketing authorization to include this extra piece of information. On the same theme, companies that have already submitted a DDPs will have to amend the marketing authorization to introduce a pharmacovigilance summary. the link to the master file location and the QPPV contact details. And so even for products where this Article 8 requirement to implement the new summary may not exist, everybody will have to have a pharmacovigilance system master file. And the timing of that depends on the product. So there is a transition article that talks about the pharmacovigilance system master file being in place for all new applications from July 2012, at the point of renewal after July 2012, or at the very latest by July 2015. Next slide, please. Okay. So the location, in a bit more detail. The location is specified as being the main site of pharmacovigilance activities or the QPPV site, and it must be within the community. So it must be in Europe. For some larger companies, primarily, the main pharmacovigilance activities can occur outside of the EU, and in which case, because the QPPV has to be in the EU, that would be the location of the master file. For smaller companies, it may be a much easier decision. It's really an organizational element. It helps us to determine for centrally authorized products who will be the supervisory authority for pharmacovigilance, and that has a bearing on organizing our inspection activities and that kind of thing. From the company point of view, it just has to be the most relevant site, and we'll be looking for that to be, as I said, the main pharmacovigilance site or the QPPV site. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in order to introduce the master file, there are the requirements for new applications on renewal or at 2015. However, we have looked at this and we take on board that actually it would be very duplicative to be running a DDPS and a master file, and many people may want to not be submitting a DDPS and might want to transfer to the master file rather earlier than that, because it will constitute a reduction in the burden of this process, and that is possible. The classification guideline for variations is being amended to account for the introduction of the master file. We're not sure that, we're hoping that's going to be published as soon as possible, but that will provide the guidance on the types of things that require change, which would be the location of the master file and the QPPV location. So what is being changed in terms of the DDPS? If I have the next slide. In the past, with the DDPS being linked to every single marketing authorization and per product, there were a large number of variations that were required for lots of different changes in the pharmacovigilance system. That DDPS also required work on behalf of the regulators who had to assess the DDPS and also have to manage those variations as well. If I can have the next slide, please. What we're moving towards is a simpler concept where the summary that is submitted is the only part that might attract a variation. The master file itself is independent of that, and the content is kept current within the company, so that at any point where it's requested or submitted, almost sort of on demand, it will be up to date and it will be current. That gets us away from versions of effectively the same document being submitted at different times. There's also further simplification because the Article 57 database is an opportunity for that information to be provided and maintained electronically. So that should help things in a practical sense too. If I can have the next slide, please. A little bit on the early adoption. If there is no renewal, then a variation can be used to move to a master file and thereby relieve the company of the requirements to maintain that DDPS. Because obviously the types of changes that will attract a variation are very different between the Article 8 summary and the DDPS. I've posed some questions in these slides. This was in part because I wanted to prompt people to think about these things for the public consultation. And I'd still be interested very much in feedback if people have thoughts on that. Next slide, please. Okay. So getting more into what this master file will actually look like. What will it be? Will it be a room full of paper? No, hopefully not. So getting a bit more into that. Representing a pharmacovigilance system can be extremely simple in a relatively straightforward pharmacovigilance environment, or it can be very complex with companies sort of working with other companies and subcontracting out various activities. The master file should be the best representation of that it can be. There is one master file per system, not per product. And if there is essentially the same system for many products, then you just have the one version of a master file. There are the possibilities that companies will operate more than one pharmacovigilance system where they have very different products that require very different activities. The most obvious example might be a company that's involved with vaccines compared to a company that mainly has consumer health products. And they may operate their pharmacovigilance in a very different way with a different set of people and completely different resources and tools. And that's a situation where there may be more than one master file. But it's certainly not driven by the number of products. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to go into a little bit of what is in the detail. It is modular, and it's full of sections asking for either descriptions or lists or data, in fact, to show the functioning of the pharmacovigilance system. The main content would be around QPPV details. That's things like where specific activities that are responsible of the QPPV and where they might be delegated, how the QP fits within the organisation, and obviously a link to the contact details, that kind of thing. There's a section on products, which primarily links to the annexes of the master file, and it's a list of the products that are covered by the master file, and a little bit about those products. Then there's the organisational structure to help us understand how the pharmacovigilance system looks around the organisation, and where the main activities for pharmacovigilance are cited, and how all that links together. And then we have sources of safety data, which are things like whether the company is involved in clinical trials or not, whether they have other programs that might attract adverse drug reaction reports. And it is trying to look at where the safety data might come from for a particular organisation, and that can differ very widely depending on the nature of the business that you're involved with. Section on computerized systems and databases, that really is a description of some of the tools that are key to conducting pharmacovigilance, what's used. If you use an Excel spreadsheet, it's good for us to understand that, or if compared to if you use some bespoke tailored pharmacovigilance software, and a little bit about how those systems are kept in good shape and are fit for purpose. So it's not presupposing that things will be done in a particular way, and actually it's very flexible. The processes, so a little bit more about understanding what processes are key within an organisation, how that's organised, how those processes are set up within a quality management system. So there's a lot of cross-referral there to the module that Suvi's previously presented. And we've got a logbook and we have annexes, and I'll come on to that in terms of change control and the sorts of things that we will have to be documenting in the master file. At the moment, the list formats are deliberately unspecified. It's so that existing systems can be used to generate the content. In some large organisations, we do not want companies to be expending time on detailing every change to an SOP that they make in the master file to make sure their list is up to date if they have a document management system that will provide that information as a sort of standard output, and we're not overly concerned about what that output is, so long as it gives us what's needed in the master file. I think going forward there may be an opportunity to provide something more along the lines of a template if people would want that. But at the moment, we haven't worked on a specific template to dictate how these lists should appear. We've just specified the content that must be in them. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, the pharmacovigilance system master file may sound a bit new, but actually it isn't. It's the sort of information that a QPPV or someone managing a pharmacovigilance system would actually have access to or should have access to in order to have oversight of the system. It's about monitoring the health of the pharmacovigilance system, being able to identify where there may be risks or weaknesses. And so some of that has been put into the master file module as well about what the objectives would be in support of the qualified person for pharmacovigilance, being able to confirm aspects of compliance, obtain information about deficiencies in the system or about risks or actual failures in the conduct of pharmacovigilance. And in addition, there's a possibility that review of the master file could help to give some assurance that the requirements in the legislation have been met, not just for the master file itself, but in terms of ongoing and routine pharmacovigilance activity. So this is all about the health of the pharmacovigilance system and oversight. I've just put a note on here that although there won't be variations when the content changes, everyone will have to be prepared to submit what is a current, up-to-date pharmacovigilance system master file content at the time when it's requested. And sort of discussions around the competent authorities and in the EMA groups are that this is not going to be a routine request. It may be the sort of thing that's requested in preparation for an inspection, which is something anyone who's been inspected by MHRA will find familiar, because it's not that different from some of the information that's already requested. Or it may be that the change control is requested so that we can identify whether, for an organisation, something fundamental has changed, and that will build into our risk-based considerations for inspections. Next slide, please. There are specific areas where the QPPV would be informed of changes in the master file, and this is really just underlining the ability of the QPPV to manage, maintain, improve the pharmacovigilance system as necessary. So things like large changes in the safety database or the validation status of data in the database, getting new contractors for certain pharmacovigilance activities. Any of you in the room that have acted as a QPPV, these are all things that you would probably be quite unhappy about if you didn't know this within your organisation, if somebody has gone off and made a major new contractual arrangement for someone to do part of pharmacovigilance and you weren't aware of it. So it's nothing new, really. There is also a part of a section in transfer of responsibilities, such that the QPPV would know about corrective and preventative actions, would know about things that might change the capacity and functioning of the system. If somebody acquires a product, that is a consideration for the functioning of the pharmacovigilance system, and these are the sorts of things that would be specified as notifiable, and then the sorts of things that we would expect to see in the change control and up to date in the master file. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just to summarise. I mean, the idea with the master file is to have a uniform information set. This actually works in terms of harmonising across Europe, where different competent authorities may ask for different information about a pharmacovigilance system, and that should now be much more harmonised. It's a tool for the QP to oversee and manage the system, and there is a reduced burden in terms of documentation, but also remember the removal of several areas of variation that would have been attracted in the past. For regulators, there's less routine assessment work. It really will be for particular reasons that the file might be requested and assessed. And there's a harmonised content, which I think for companies that makes it much easier if you're all being asked for one sort of thing and not having to produce it at varying times as well. Next slide, please. So that was my question, how we can maximise the guidance. If you haven't put questions in for the public consultation, I'm sure there's going to be more opportunities to provide questions and comments. So just keep, please, providing your thoughts, and some of the questions we'll deal with on the panel later. Thank you.
Thank you.